Hello, I'm Dan Coppersmith, and this is the second video of how to fly fish with a spinning rod. The first video I did shows you the basic high-level overview of how to use the lure as a casting weight and as a tractor and have two flies behind it. You fish all the flies, dry flies, wet flies, nymphs, soft tackles, streamers, everything. You can all fish it behind the lure. You catch fish on both the lure and the flies. And this method works better than fishing just lures alone. It works better than fishing just flies alone. You get the best of both worlds. Now in this video, I'm going to go over some of the little details that can help you to fly fish with a spinning rod. The number one problem that people have when they try this technique is tangles. Their line gets tangled. They're out there casting away and they get all tangled up. That's no fun. Tangles are no fun. You don't want to be doing this if you're getting tangles, and you shouldn't be getting tangles if you do this right. The way to avoid tangles, very simple. Use stiff line. That's right, use stiff line. Stiff line will not tangle. I recommend using at least 6-pound line. If you use very light line, you're going to get a lot of tangles. It's not going to work. Don't do it. But 6-pound line, in fact, I would use 6-pound line anyways, because if you use the lighter line, I used to use lighter line, and you know, sometimes the fish will break it. Sometimes I'd lose up to 3 trout in a day because they would break the line. These are a nice sized trout. Sometimes they're a medium-sized trout. They just run in the current or they run under a log. Another good thing about using the heavier line is that if you use very light line, the fish fights a very long time, especially the big ones, and then the fish can fight itself to exhaustion. That's not good for the fish. If you plan on releasing your fish, and I hope you release some of them, you want to get the fish in a little faster, release it faster, and it'll have a better chance of living. Using at least 6-pound line can help you do that. Some people have told me though that they can't use 6-pound line because it's too visible. They fish very clear waters and streams that get a fair amount of pressure, and they're afraid that those fish will see the 6-pound test line. Well, to them I say that you need to employ the second method, which is to use fluorocarbon. Yes, use a fluorocarbon leader. Fluorocarbon has virtually the same index of refraction as does water. That means that when fluorocarbon is in the water, it's virtually invisible. The fish are going to have a very hard time seeing 6-pound fluorocarbon, even in the clearest of water. This willy bugger is being pulled by 11-pound fluorocarbon. If you slow down the film and magnify it, you will observe it is still very difficult to see the line. The trout will spot a lot of imperfections in your fly long before it'll see your 6-pound fluorocarbon. More importantly, fluorocarbon is very stiff. It's a lot more stiff than monofilament. Now it is also a little more expensive. Well, you're just buying enough for your leaders, not filling up your whole spool with fluorocarbon. So it won't cost you much in the long run, just a couple extra dollars here and there. The extra fish are worth it. And the tendency of fluorocarbon is that it rarely gets tangled. You can even go down to 5-pound fluorocarbon if you want, although I'd recommend you stay with 6. I've used 5-pound fluorocarbon and I fish just fine with it. I rarely get a tangle even with 5-pound fluorocarbon. There are a lot of different vendors and makers of fluorocarbon. Some advertise their line as being more supple, more flexible. Flexibility is an attribute that the traditional fly rod fishermen would like to have because it allows them to get a more natural drift when they're fishing their dry flies in a river which has got complex currents that might pull the line this way and that way. For a spinning rod fisherman, you don't need flexibility, you don't want flexibility in your line. Either the lure and the flies, they're moving kind of forward fast in the water and they're moving under a straight line, which is fine, or you are, if you're fishing a dry fly on a river that's drifting down, your main line from your rod tip to the, if you're fishing a floating crankbait, it's going to be above the water and it's going to be not grabbed by the currents. You have just a couple feet of line from your floating crankbait to your dry fly, and just those couple feet are not a big deal. It's actually a far superior way to fly fishing a dry fly with a traditional fly rod, and it really doesn't require the flexibility in your line. So try to use 6-pound, no less than 5-pound line, and try to use fluorocarbon for your leaders. It will eliminate your tangles very much. The main line that I use on my spool, on my reel, typically I like to use 10-pound braided line. 10-pound braided line, it's about the same diameter as 4-pound monofilament, It casts very far. It is a very strong, durable, reliable line, and it's also opaque. I mean, I can see this thing from pretty far away. I like to see my line because then I can kind of guide it around rocks and stumps. I can make sure that my flies and lures are in the current seam, whatever parts of the stream that I think the trout are in. So I like to see my line. Of course, the trout can also see this braided line from pretty far away. This line only connects to the lure, and I'm not really trying to catch fish on the lure, I'm trying to catch fish on the flies. Before I learned to fly fish, I used to fish with this braided line and just a lure, and I did pretty good. I caught quite a few fish. Sometimes I catch over 30 fish a day fishing braided line in the lure. Now usually if a fish is going to hit a lure, it's not paying much attention to what it's doing, otherwise it would notice the lure is not real. But you know, I've tried adding a fluorocarbon leader to my lure. You can use the FG knot to connect a fluorocarbon leader to braided line. You can go on YouTube to look up how to tie an FG knot. It's a little complicated, but it is a very good knot. And in my experience of doing this, adding a fluorocarbon leader in front of my lure has not significantly increased the number of trout that I catch on the lure. I still catch about 10 or 15% of my trout on the lure versus the flies. So I just tie my braided line directly to my lure and it works fine. And I recommend you shouldn't have to add a fluorocarbon leader to your lure. But you need to add fluorocarbon leaders to your main flies. When you're fishing lures and flies, you might kind of wonder, how do you bring this stuff with you? How do you bring your lures and your flies with you when you're fishing? Well, you know, in your fishing vest, you got these two big pockets on the side. And in one pocket, I like to bring my fly box with me. And this is kind of a small fly box. It's very good for a lot of small to medium-sized flies. Put them all here. And then in my other large pocket, I've got a little tackle box. It's got all my crankbaits, my spinners, my spoons, and my swivels. Now, my fly box here, it's not real good at holding the real big fat flies like a big foam hopper or a big woolly bugger. So what I usually do is I will put some of the big flies that I will most likely use on that day, I put them in my tackle box. I make a little room just for my big flies in my tackle box. If I think I might need more flies, then I bring my big fly box with me. I leave it in my backpack, and this has got all my big fat flies in case I run out. And it works out pretty good. Lately I went ahead and I got a much larger fly box. It just barely fits in my pocket, but it does have room for my big flies as well as all my little flies. So you'll see that as you get more flies, you're going to need more fly boxes. Now suppose you're fishing a couple nymphs and then all of a sudden it gets cloudy out and the bug starts hatching and you start seeing trout feeding on the surface. And you say, hey, right now it'd be great to fish some dry flies. Okay, so you're going to take those nymphs off and all that fluorocarbon and a nice rig you've got tied, and you figure you're probably going to use your nymphs tomorrow. So it'll be a shame to have to, you know, cut everything and then retie everything tomorrow. So what I like to do in that case, I got a little pocket along the side of my vest. I've got a little foam spool, and I'll take those nymphs, I cut them right where they are attached to the main line, and I just wrap them around this little spool here, and then you can hook the nymphs into the foam spool. And I also cut a little, with a knife, I cut a little 45-degree angle along the edge of the spool. I can put the tag end of the loose line into that. And then I take this little spool with the pre-rigged nymphs on it, and I put it in my fly vest. And then the next day when I want to fish nymphs, I can take it out and very quickly be fishing nymphs without having to retie everything, without having to lose a few feet of that fluorocarbon line. It's a very little convenient thing that you can try, and I find it's useful for me.